I greet you, ladies and gentlemen, at this time as I cover the content of the Applied Research Methodology course. Those who are my students that I'm taking for this course, the second year students at the National University of Science and Technology. I just want to announce to you that this is the preliminary lecture that we are doing in connection with this course outline. Basically, what I'm going to do, I'm going to cover the content of this module in three main parts. The first part will be dealing with the theoretical and other conceptual issues related to research methodology. The second part will be looking at the structure of a research project, the structure of a research project. Basically, I'll be giving you an overview or a feel of a research project that we expect you to craft or to produce in your final year, from chapter 1 up to chapter 5, or from preliminary pages up to the appendices, the appendix or the appendices. So, and then that will be the second part. The third part will be an excursion into data analysis. So what I'm going to cover today is a brief introduction into theoretical and conceptual issues that are associated with research methodology. And for me to operationalize that coverage, I'm going to revisit what I presented recently when I was having the research methodology seminar online with our final year master's degree students or part 3 students, where I covered research paradigms. So, so basically what we are going to cover in this first part of the module, we are going to cover a definition of research, a definition of development. We'll explore the reasons for research, the difference between research and development. We'll also look at the literature survey, research proposal writing, data collection and data analysis, data mining, presentation of technical information, and technical report writing, and issues to do with intellectual property or issues that impinge on plagiarism, and also the process of deriving theorems, laws, and other principles from research findings. So this is what we're going to cover in this course. The overarching issue or concept that we're going to examine in this first part of our module is the issue of research paradigms, because there are research paradigms that underpin any research activity. There are research paradigms that underpin any research activity, because research as undertaken in modern societies is philosophic work. Any research that you can think of, ladies and gentlemen, is philosophical. So I want you to understand the three aspects of research, which three aspects are ontology, methodology, and the aspect of research paradigms. So I want you to understand those three dimensions or aspects of research. We have got ontology, methodology, and some say epistemology. The order is not particularly important, but the key thing is that in today's installment, we'll dwell a bit on research paradigms. What do you mean by research paradigms? Why are research paradigms important for us to understand the process of research? Why are research philosophies imperative for us to understand the process of research? When we are undertaking research in finance, or research in economics, or research in financial econometrics or in banking, is it really important for us to dwell on research paradigms? What underpins contemporary research as recorded or captured in the extant literature? What research paradigms or paradigm underpins contemporary research in banking or finance, for instance? These are issues or questions that I want you to be grappling with as I present the content on research paradigms. Basically, without much ado, we want to examine the issue of epistemology, ontology, methodology, and axiology. Basically, I want to zero in on the first three, which are epistemology, ontology, and methodology. Because these three, they form the tripod of research upon which the whole philosophy of research is actually based. According to Lincoln and Cooper in their research document, which was published in 1985, they pointed out that a paradigm of research consists of 4 elements. And the 4 elements of a paradigm of research are, namely, epistemology, ontology, methodology, and axiology. So it's very important for me to tackle each and every one of those elements of a paradigm. But before I go any further, it presupposes, my coverage presupposes that we've already defined what a paradigm is. I will just give you a working definition later on, maybe either towards the end of this lecture or in a subsequent lecture, which is a follow-up lecture to this one that I'm delivering at this time. I may give a more formal definition of a paradigm. The word which is transliterated or translated paradigm, it's derived from a word which means a pattern. A pattern. So a paradigm, it is a pattern in research that emerges from the theoretical framework and the practice of research as a process by a group of scholars or by a particular scholar in a certain field. It's a pattern which emerges, and a pattern takes time to emerge when it comes to how people conduct a particular process. So when we are looking at the 4 aspects of a research paradigm, the first one that I mentioned, ladies and gentlemen, is the aspect of epistemology. The second one, which I mentioned, is the aspect of ontology. The third one, which I mentioned, is the aspect of methodology. And the fourth one, which I mentioned, is the aspect of axiology. So I want to briefly examine or explore the issue or the concept of the epistemology of a research paradigm. When we look at epistemology, it's a term which is derived from the Greek. You know, when you see the ology part, it tells you that the word is Greek, or at least it's a hybrid of one concept in another language and another concept in the Greek language. Because the Greeks, you know, even years before Christ, they were the philosophers that, you know, dominated education, so to speak. So when we are looking at epistemology in Greek, it comes from the word epistem, which is spelled E-P-I-S-T-E-M-E, which means knowledge. So when we are looking at epistem, it means knowledge. So put simply, epistemology is used to describe how we come to know something, how we come to perceive reality, or how we come to apprehend or comprehend reality, or how we come to grapple with reality. So when we are looking at epistemology, it is that knowledge which helps us to have an awareness of reality. Because for us to be able to function in our physical and other environments, we have to have an awareness of reality. Without an accurate and a relevant awareness of reality, we become dysfunctional in the modern societies in which we live. For us to be able to function optimally and for us to be able to function logically, for us to be able to function effectively as human beings, we have to be to have knowledge. We have to have that ability to harness information from the environment around us, make sense of that information in order for us to be able to interact or to interact with reality, so to speak. So when we are looking at epistemology, it is concerned with the very basis of knowledge, basis as in plural, not basis as in singular, as BASIS, but basis as in BASES, the very basis or foundations of knowledge. What do we mean when we are talking about the very basis or foundations of knowledge? We are talking about the nature of knowledge. When you are investigating concepts in economics, what is the nature of knowledge in economics? When you are investigating concepts in finance or financial econometrics, what is the nature of knowledge? And we also are concerned with the forms of knowledge that prevail in a particular field or discipline. And also, we also examine the related aspect of how knowledge can be acquired and how it can be communicated to other human beings. All these are aspects or dimensions or facets of epistemology. Because when you are undertaking research, not only are you concerned with the gathering of information, you are also concerned with the dissemination of that information to fellow human beings, either in your field or to disciplines or areas of life or concentrations of life or focuses of life that are further afield from your own field of specialization as a scholar, as an academic, or as a researcher. So we, once more, what we are concerned with when we are looking at the epistemology of a paradigm, we are concerned with the basis of knowledge, which are the nature of knowledge. Number two, the form of knowledge. Number three, how knowledge is disseminated to fellow human beings so that knowledge is communicated. Now, when we are looking at knowledge, it's very imperative that I point out the four sources of knowledge that have been covered by researchers such as Lavin, who undertook his study or research and published it in 1984, as well as other researchers. They identify four sources of knowledge, which are intuitive knowledge, authoritative knowledge, logical knowledge, and empirical knowledge. I leave that as an exercise for you to examine what intuitive knowledge is all about, what authoritative knowledge is all about, what logical knowledge entails, and what empirical knowledge actually comprises or consists of. But suffice it to say that epistemology is important because it helps us to establish faith that we put in our data. Because when you are trying to arrive at knowledge about a certain issue or issues, there is data that you gather. For you to have faith or confidence in the data that you gather and process, it means your epistemological basis, in as much as we relate it to this concept or issue of paradigm, it must be watertight and it must satisfy the requirements or the expectations of a particular discipline. The next aspect of a research paradigm is the ontology of a research paradigm. When we are looking at the ontology of a research paradigm, ontology is a branch of philosophy which is concerned with the assumptions we make in order to believe that something makes sense or is real, and the very nature or essence of social phenomenon we are investigating, according to Scotland in 2012. So it has to do with assumptions. There is no study, whether it's a study in the so-called hard sciences, or it's a study in the so-called soft sciences like your economics, your finance, your banking. All studies, they hinge on certain assumptions. Even those studies which are undertaken under laboratory conditions, there are certain assumptions which those people undertake laboratory experiments, the physical scientists actually make. They make certain assumptions about room temperature. They make certain assumptions about the dynamic behavior of chemicals or elements that they'll be testing in a laboratory. There are so many assumptions that they make. Those assumptions might not be stated explicitly, but the people who are practitioners of a particular field, they know the implied and the stated assumptions, which impinge on, gathering knowledge in their own field of study. So basically, when we are looking at ontology once more, it is a branch of philosophy which is concerned with the assumptions that we make in order to believe that something makes sense or is real. For us to believe that supply and demand makes sense or is real, it's based on a set of assumptions that we make. One of the assumptions is the ceteris paribus assumption. And also the assumptions, they impinge on the very nature or essence of whatever social phenomenon or economic phenomenon we're investigating. So when we are looking at the ontology of a paradigm, what we are looking at is the philosophical study of the nature of existence or reality, or of being or becoming, as well as the basic categories of things that exist and their relations or how they interact. So when we are looking at ontology, it's actually an advanced aspect of research where we examine our underlying belief system as researchers, or our underlying belief systems as researchers about the nature of being and the existence of being. When we are looking at concepts of supply and demand, are they self-existent? Are these concepts contrived concepts? Does supply and demand really exist, or it's something which is just contrived in the mind of economic philosophers? Those questions are answered, I mean to say, within the context of the ontology of a research paradigm. Ontology is essential to a paradigm because it helps to provide an understanding of the things that constitute the world as it is known, what we call the financial system. When we are looking at the financial system, how do we know that the financial system exists? What exactly constitutes this thing which we call the financial system, this animal which we call the financial system? When we are talking about the economic system of a country, what exactly are we talking about? Is it something which you can go out into the field and observe? Or the financial or economic system is something which we have to understand, mediated by a certain ontological basis or ontological approach to reality? So that's why I'm saying ontology is so essential to a paradigm, because it helps to provide an understanding of the things that constitute the world as it is known. And by the world, I'm referring to both the physical world and the metaphysical world. The world as conceptualized by human beings, and the world which anyone can readily observe when they are moving around. So the research paradigm seeks to determine the real nature or the foundational concepts which constitute themes that we analyze to make sense of the meaning embedded in research data. Very soon, I will ask you to come up with a research topic. And after coming up with a research topic, to produce a research proposal as a requirement of this applied research methodology course. But for you to craft a research topic, you must be in a position to determine the real nature or the foundational concepts that constitute certain themes in finance, economics, or banking. Otherwise, if you are incapable of determining the real nature or the foundational concepts that constitute the main themes in economics, you won't be able to distill a meaningful research topic from the data, the research data that you gather when you are doing your literature survey. Through the ontology of a research paradigm, you are able to grapple with the following research questions, or the following questions, I mean to say. These are just the philosophic questions. Number one, is there a reality out there in the social or financial or economic order of the world? Or it's a construction created by one's own mind? Is there reality which has got an objective existence, separate from the people who have articulated that reality? Number two, what is the nature of that reality if it exists? If that reality exists, what is its nature? What is the nature of that reality? Number three, in other words, is reality of an objective nature or the result of individual cognition? What we call an economic system. Does an economic system actually exist in the objective world, such that we can, use objective means of testing its existence? Or reality, I mean this economic reality, for instance, or the financial system, for instance, is just a result of individual cognition. It's Dr. Ian Ndlov and his colleagues in finance or economics who say there is an economic system, but there is no objective way of verifying whether an economic system actually exists. The next question, what is the nature of the situation which is being studied? Because reality is very dynamic and it's always in a state of flux. So what is the nature of the situation being studied? So ontology enables us to examine our underlying belief system and the philosophical assumptions or the philosophical assumptions that we have underpinning our research process or our research excursion about the nature of being, existence, and reality. Number one, the nature of being. Number two, the existence of being. Number three, the reality of being. Because when you are looking at being, it has got three aspects: its nature, its existence, and its reality. So these philosophical assumptions are about the nature of reality are critical in our understanding of the data that we gather from the real world or from the world around us. And these assumptions, concepts, or propositions, they help to orientate our thinking about a research problem, its significance, and how we might approach a particular research problem in order to answer our fundamental research questions or our fundamental research question, in order to understand the problem that we're investigating, and thus walk step by step towards the solution of the problem that we're investigating. So I've just covered two parts, two aspects of a research paradigm, which are the epistemology of a research paradigm and the ontology of a research paradigm. I'm now moving on to the third aspect of a research paradigm, which is the methodology of a research paradigm. Now, this course is called Applied Research Methods, or just the methodology course. Though, from a philosophic perspective, to a person like me, the name Applied Research Methods or Applied Research Methodology is an inaccurate name or an inaccurate characterization of the course, because there are many dimensions to knowledge other than methodology, as I've just outlined. There is the epistemological dimension, the ontological dimension, as well as the methodological dimension and the axiology of a research paradigm. So when we are looking at methodology, which gives us the nomenclature of the module that we are actually grappling with in this exegesis or in this delivery. Methodology is a broad term which is used to refer to issues such as research design, the methods of actually undertaking research, approaches and procedures that are used in an investigation that is well planned to find out something, according to Gibbs in 1997. For instance, data gathering, participants, instruments that are used, and data analysis are all parts of a broad field of research methodology. So when you are looking at research methodology, some of its components, they include the gathering of data as a holistic process, as in the design that inspires your gathering of data, what we call the research design, and also the data gathering instruments and the philosophic underpinnings that underpin or that anchor the research instruments that are actually deployed in order to gather data, and the selection of participants that become involved in the process of gathering information and also analyzing that information, as well as data analysis itself. So when we are looking at research methodology, in summary, research methodology involves the articulation of the logic and the flow of systematic processes that are engaged in when one is undertaking research. When one is undertaking research, there are systematic processes that one is expected to follow, because the research is not a haphazard activity. It is a step-by-step activity where we move from the identification of the problem, the statement of the problem, the articulation of the research objective and the attendant research objectives, the flipping of those research objectives into research questions, the summary of those research objectives and research questions into a meaningful research hypothesis, and the deployment of research methodologies in order to gather data and test the research hypothesis. All these things, they are part of research methodology. It's important for me to point out that research methodology, though broad and including data gathering, participants, instruments used, and data analysis, it is a systematic step-by-step process. And then we move on to the axiology of a research paradigm. When we are looking at the axiology of a research paradigm, we are looking at ethical issues that need to be considered when planning a research proposal, especially for those of our researchers whose studies have to involve interacting with the fellow human beings in order to gather data. It will be wrong and it biases the results if a researcher starts to dole out funds or to dole out some donations in order to incentivize the research subjects to participate in a particular research, because the information which is gathered, it becomes colored with whatever was done in order to manipulate to manipulate the participation or to improve the reception of responses from the potential respondents or the research subjects. So issues to do with manipulation, oppression, obsession, and all of that involving human research subjects or even animal research subjects, they impinge on the ethics of research. Even those who are doing biology, there are definite state or governmental laws that govern how animals are used in research. And those laws are even more stringent for those researchers that undertake the gathering of information involving human beings. The gathering of information involving minors, children, small children of school-going age. There is a way in which research is undertaken when someone wants to gather information among small children. Maybe you want to investigate the demand for sweets in a particular neighborhood or in a particular city. Such a study would inevitably involve you interacting with minors in a society. When you are interacting with minors, after you have interacted with them and you are talking about sweets, the ethics of research, they go on to say, how will you desensitize the minor subjects that are involved in the research from the subject that you introduced to them, which subject they might not have been fully aware of, or they might not have been concerned with. But after you start to release a lot of information or to provoke the generation of a lot of information about these sweets or biscuits, the minor subjects, it might alter their behavior. So it has to do with ethics. You as a researcher, you might say, I want to objectively discover over a period of 7 months, the demand for sweets among children who are between the ages of 5 and the age of 15, up to the early teenage years. But there you are interacting with people who are minors in society. So issues to do with child laws, how you gather information from children, who has to be present when information is gathered from children, how information from children is quoted, how children are desensitized once information has been gathered from them, and how children are actually rehabilitated if the study is psychologically manipulative to them, or it awakens certain memories, like, psychologists who gather information which may affect people emotionally when that information is gathered, or when certain questions are asked. All of that, it impinges on the ethics of research, which is the fourth dimension of the research paradigm, which is the axiology of the research paradigm. So to summarize, the axiology of the research paradigm has to do with what we call the teleology of the theory, which has to do with morality. Morality has to do with what is intrinsically good or desirable. What is intrinsically good or desirable. And then we've got issues to do with fairness. I don't want to introduce a lot of terminology, but each and every society has got its own moral values. There are principles which are which are summarized in a concept which is known as PAPA. PAPA. And this PAPA is spelled P-A-P-A, which means privacy, accuracy, property, and accessibility. Privacy, accuracy, property, and accessibility. There are issues to do with privacy. When people are interacting with you as a researcher in a particular study, do you keep the information private? Do you keep the information private if people volunteer to share their information or to share the information that you are looking for? Number one. Number two, do you force research subjects to reveal private information or confidential information? This impinges on the axiology of a research paradigm. And then accuracy. This principle considers who is responsible for the authenticity, fidelity, and accuracy of information. So it's the duty of each and every researcher to cross-check with participants so that they know that the information which has been recorded has been captured accurately, so that whatever was articulated by the research subjects is not misrepresented. Property. Under this principle, one needs to consider who will own the data when the data has been gathered, and also to consider issues of payment for the data, especially if the data is to be part of something which will be patented or copyrighted. If so, what will be the just and fair prices for the exchange of the data? Because there are some pieces of data, especially numeric financial data, like the daily stock returns or the daily stock prices. Some sources of that information, they sell it. Once the information is sold and it's manipulated into something else, the financial returns or the oil prices, the intraday oil price changes of your Brent and your Texas Intermediate, that information, after you have cleaned it and manipulated it, who then owns it? Is it the London, stock exchanges, or is it the sources of that information in developed countries, or you own that information? Who will own the channels such as publications and media through which information will be disseminated? These issues impinge on things like copyright and so on. And then accessibility. This principle considers who will have access to the data. How will the data be kept safe and secure? And under what conditions and with what safeguards will the researcher or researchers and participants have access to the data? And how the access to the data will be gained? So these are aspects of the research paradigm that I wanted us to consider. And before I conclude this lecture, I want to consider the main research paradigms that are influencing research during our time. I will dwell quite a bit on the positivist research paradigm. The positivist research paradigm. Because the positivist research paradigm is the research paradigm that under which, our own broad group of social sciences actually falls. You've got the phenomenological school and many other schools, critical theory and so on, which are outside the purview of finance, as it were. Now, when we look at the positivist research paradigm, there is so many research paradigms. Other research paradigms, I'm going to look at them in passing, but I will dwell more particularly and more deliberately on the positivist research paradigm. Because when you are undertaking research in finance or economics, it's highly likely that you will encounter literature of a positivist nature, what we call the hypothetical deductive approach. What we call the hypothetical deductive approach to research. So when we are looking at research paradigms, the main research paradigms are actually three. There are three main taxonomies or groupings when it comes to research paradigms, which are the positivist, the interpretivist, and also critical paradigms. So once more, we've got the positivist, the interpretivist, and critical paradigms. And I've already told you that our bias in finance and economics, it's towards the positivist research paradigm. According to, history, philosophical history, we are told that the first philosopher who proposed the positivist research paradigm was the French philosopher Auguste Comte, who lived between 1798 and 1857. And according to Auguste Comte, the positivist paradigm defines a worldview to research which is grounded in what is known in research methods as the scientific method of investigation. So basically, when we are looking at the positivist paradigm or school of research, it has to do with what is called the scientific method. In his writing in 1856, Comte postulated that experimentation, observation, and reason based on experience ought to be the basis of understanding human behavior. I'll take that again. In his writing, in his publication, which was published in 1856, Auguste Comte postulated, he postulated that experimentation, observation, and reason based on experience ought to be the basis of understanding human behavior, and therefore the only legitimate means of extending knowledge and human understanding. So in its pure form, the scientific method involves a process of experimentation that is used to explore observations and answer questions. Explore observations and answer questions. When we are exploring observations and answering questions, basically we follow what is called the scientific approach. This scientific approach is as follows. Step number one is to ask a question. After you've asked a question, you do a background research. Sometimes when you do background research, you discover that the way you asked a question, it was a bit inaccurate, because you may ask a question wrongly, and when you are doing your literature search, which is part of doing background research, you may discover that you ignored a very critical aspect of articulating a particular question. So you have to go back to the question and re-ask the question. So you ask a question, which is just an expression of your provocation to research. Because for you to undertake research, you must be provoked. There must be something which is propelling you to research. This something which is propelling you to research, with or without a question mark, is what we mean by asking a question. And then after you've asked a question as a human being, we expect you systematically to do background research, what we call the literature survey. This background research is not literature review, but it's just a literature survey which assists you to formulate the background of the problem that you want to investigate, or this question that you want to grapple with. And then after you have successfully done your background research, you construct a hypothesis according to the scientific method. You construct a research hypothesis, or a series of research hypotheses that break down the question that you would have asked. And after the construction or the formulation of research hypothesis, you mount specific experiments or a specific experiment to test the hypothesis with. And then in your testing of the hypothesis, you come up with a procedure of working, or the modus operandi of dealing with the hypothesis, where if the answer is no, you troubleshoot the procedure, carefully checking all steps, and you reset up the experiment. You may discover that there is a certain critical element that you ignored when you were setting up or mounting the experiment. So if the answer is no, when you are checking whether the procedure is working, you then troubleshoot. This is very common in computer science. When you are trying to come up with a software program to execute a certain task, maybe to estimate an economic model or to estimate a certain financial econometric model, you discover that the software program or the syntax is not working. You then remount the experiment by making sure that you specify everything that was supposed to be, all the parameters that were supposed to be specified in your simple syntax or in your complicated syntax for coming up with an econometric model. In other words, you troubleshoot, you debug, and you do everything for your experiment to work when you revisit it. If your experiment is working, then you analyze the data and draw conclusions. Basically, when you analyze the data and draw conclusions, you can follow either of two paths, I mean to say. First, the results, you may discover that the results align with your research hypothesis, in which case the next step is to communicate those results which align with your research hypothesis. Second, you may discover that your results align only partially or not at all with any of the research hypotheses that you stated. In that case, instead of communicating the results which don't align with your research hypothesis, you may have a feedback loop. This feedback loop to the construction of the hypothesis, taking you to the reconstruction of the previous hypothesis, may entail having experimental data which becomes background research for new or future research projects. You ask new questions, pertinent questions. You formulate new hypotheses, and then you re-experiment or you experiment again and follow the same process that I articulated, leading to the communication of results from the preliminary process or the preliminary step of asking the question. This is what is known as the scientific method. And this scientific method is courtesy of Auguste Comte. As you can see, it's a step-by-step process. We move from one step to another. The scientific method, it is quite, it is quite calibrated. It's quite logical. We move from one step to another. We don't move haphazardly. We don't move intuitively. We don't follow intuitive reasoning. We don't just follow experiences which we can't replicate or duplicate, or which can't be replicated under semi-laboratory conditions, but it's something which any other person can follow and also derive their own results or gather their own data in order to derive certain principles. That's the scientific method, which the positivist research paradigm is all about. So when we are looking at research which is located in this paradigm, the positivist paradigm, it relies on deductive logic, formulation of hypotheses, testing those hypotheses, and offering operational definitions, as well as mathematical equations, calculations, extrapolations, and expressions in order to arrive at research conclusions. The aim, ladies and gentlemen, is to provide explanations to make predictions which are based on measurable outcomes. To make predictions which are based on measurable outcomes. Those measurable outcomes are underpinned by 4 assumptions, which were observed by Cohen, Mannion, and Morrison in 2000, which are determinism, empiricism, parsimony, and generalizability. So when we are looking at the measurable outcomes that are derived from the scientific method that I briefly outlined in terms of its steps, we are looking at measurable outcomes which are underpinned by 4 assumptions, according to Cohen, Mannion, and Morrison, 2000, in their publication, which was published in 2000. And the 4 assumptions are determinism, empiricism, parsimony, and generalizability. Now, when we unpack each of these assumptions, generally, when we are looking at determinism, it means that the events that we observe are caused by other factors. So, since events or processes that we observed are caused by other factors, if we are to understand the causal relationships among factors, we need to be able to make predictions and to control the potential impacts of other explanatory factors on the dependent factors. If I am to put this point or articulate this point the other way, what I'm explaining to you under determinism is that when we are observing events or processes in the real world, we must be in a position to explain how one set of factors causes other factors, or one set of variables causes other variables to behave in a certain way. For us to be able to do that, we must be in a position to isolate what we consider to be causal variables and what we consider to be caused variables. In other words, explanatory variables and explained variables. And then after we've isolated, we have to look at the interaction between explained variables and explanatory variables. And we control for other variables that may affect dependent variables, but which we are not studying at the moment. And then when we are looking at the assumption of empiricism, according to this assumption, it's imperative for us to be able to investigate a research problem. And since it's imperative for us to be able to research a particular research problem, we need to be able to correct verifiable empirical data. Verifiable empirical data which supports the theoretical framework that we have chosen in order to undertake a particular research. So when you are undertaking research, according to the assumption of empiricism, you can't have a certain theoretical framework, and then the data that you are gathering is data, number one, which can't be verified, number two, which doesn't tally with the theoretical framework which has been chosen. It's not allowed. If you do that, you won't be able to test the hypothesis that you have formulated. There will be a disconnect between your theoretical framework and the hypothesis that you will eventually test after gathering the data. So empiricism, simply put, it means for us to be able to investigate a research problem, we need to be able to collect verifiable empirical data, which supports the theoretical framework that a researcher has chosen for their study, and which empirical data will enable the researcher to test the hypothesis in singular with SIS and in plural with SES at the end that the researcher has formulated. How about parsimony? When we are looking at parsimony of the 4 assumptions that underkey measurable outcomes. When we are looking at parsimony, the positivist paradigm refers to the researchers' attempts to explain the phenomena they study in the most economic way possible, In other words, it's very imperative or important that the researcher does not spoil us for words, if I may put it that way. That the researcher does not waste our time by over-explaining or over-exerting himself to explain a very small phenomenon. The researcher must be able to articulate whatever they're explaining to us, you know, in an economic way, if I may put it that way. There must be precision. The explanations must be concise. The explanations must be straight to the point. The researcher must not meander. The researcher must not drag in a lot of irrelevant issues. The researcher must go straight to the point. That's why sometimes when we are looking at this assumption of parsimony, it's called simple parsimony. Even when we are stating mathematical concepts, it's very important when finally you are deriving theorems that you are not unnecessarily too complicated, that you simplify things. You just following logic, you simplify things, and to summarize summarize issues or principles in a manner that does not leave a person with more questions than answers. At the end of the day, when certain theorems have been formulated or certain principles have been derived, the person who is reading or other researchers in the field, they must be able, from this most economic way possible that has been used to explain a phenomenon, to be able to understand how, how hypotheses were tested and how principles were actually derived. And then the last aspect of, measurable outcomes is the generalizability assumption, which tells us that the results obtained from a study or a research project conducted within this positivist research paradigm in one context should be applicable to other contexts or situations by inductive inferences. This implies that the positivist researcher or the researcher in economics or finance or financial economics, econometrics, or even financial economics should be able to observe occurrences in the particular phenomenon they have studied and be able to generalize about what can be expected elsewhere in the world of a similar nature. And because of these assumptions that I've just articulated, these assumptions of, the assumptions of determinism, empiricism, parsimony, and generalizability, the positivist research paradigm has become so popular because what is done by one set of researchers, it can be mimicked or easily followed or replicated by other researchers. There is no spontaneity and subjectivity in whatever is done by one group of scholars, which can be replicated by another group of scholars. Now, as I move to the conclusion of what I want to present about the positivist research paradigm, I just want to point out that there are 4 foundational elements or assumptions of a paradigm, which we just covered. I don't need to rehash them. If we are to look at the positivist research paradigm, for instance, the epistemology of the positivist research paradigm is to be objectivist. The positivist researcher tries by all means to be objective. So their epistemology is objectivist. Whatever knowledge is gathered through the scientific method, it must be knowledge or data which is objective, not subjective. When we are looking at the ontology is naive realism. Naive realism, it's a reality which is observed out there or which is explained out there, which doesn't have all of this philosophic content fed into it, all this subjectivity fed into it, which is just a reality which we are almost accepting a surface value and moving on with our assumptions in order to grapple with or attack this reality, so that we either enhance our knowledge of this reality or we reshape this reality in terms of our objective understanding of this reality. And the methodology is experimental, obviously, because I've given you a design which involves experimentation. And the axiology is the beneficence axiology, the beneficence axiology. I don't want to go into major details on this because we are not doing philosophy per se, but I want to just summarize that when we are looking at a belief in a theory which is universal or law-like, or has law-like generalizations, a belief or in a theory which is law-like, has got law-like generalization, a belief or a theory that is universal or has law-like generalizations, it's most probably, it will be most probable that we are looking at the positivist research paradigm. We will be looking at the positivist research paradigm. And the belief that results of inquiry can be quantified. In the scientific method, there is an attempt to quantify everything, even qualitative aspects of variables or interactions among variables. They are converted into quantitative constructs like 1, 2, 3 for your ABCD, which can be distilled into numbers so as to analyze behavior. That's the the scientific method or the positivist research paradigm. So I believe that today I've given you quite a lot of content when it comes to issues to do with research paradigms. So in my next lecture, I'm going to conclude this exegesis or this delivery on research paradigms. I will not dwell much on the interpretivist and the pragmatic research paradigms, because these do not impinge much on economics and finance and banking, or even financial economics, as well as financial econometrics. I don't want to overload you with information which is not going to help you as you go further in your studies. So I believe that what I've covered today will assist you in understanding the particulars of research paradigms. I thank you so much. Have a good morning, and remember to share this video with your colleagues and also to subscribe to my channel. Thank you.